Okay, it's 12:35, so let's get started. So today we're talking about the DSGE model. As you saw, a pretty simple model. We went through all these complicated ways of thinking about rigidities, nominal rigidities, menu costs. We had this information frictions. And then we get to the end and you can see that really it's just a very simple model. And in fact, I was struck this time kind of rewatching my video I made last year and then just thinking about the slides about how similar it really is to like a, with all these bells and whistles, we sort of end up with something that looks very similar to a undergraduate Keynesian model. So maybe we can talk about that in just a second. Let me share my screen here. Sound. My slides here. Oops. On the other screen. No, they disappeared. So we here are the three basic equations. And this really is an IS curve, right? We're relating output to the interest rate. And it's exactly what I just taught when I did a macro 101. I guess the only difference is that here we have expectations. And then here's the Phillips curve. And again, Phillips curve, you guys well know, it's inflation and unemployment. But of course, the unemployment in a very sort of direct way is related to output, right? If you have less people employed, then you have lower output. So, another way of thinking about the Phillips curve is a relationship between inflation and output. Here you go. It's the same thing. Now we just have this extra expectation term. And then finally, we have here a monetary policy rule, which is just sort of assuming the central bank is going to, look forward, see what the interest rate, the inflation rate is going to be. If the inflation rate's high, well, then they're going to have a higher interest rate, which is going to slow the economy down. If the output tomorrow is high, if there's a boom, that means they're going to have a higher interest rate and slow the economy down. So I was sort of struck here that after all this work, we sort of end up with something that doesn't look that much different than what you get in Macro 101. But that's neither here or there. Let's jump to the Kahoots. It's this one.
Are you gonna share the beautiful music with us?
You hear now?
Yeah, that's what I needed.
All right, yeah. Otherwise, I can sing it myself if you want. Dun, 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 dun. How many do we have today? 4, 5, 6, 7. Not everybody wants. Okay, there we go. Got 6. I think there's 7 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right. Somebody's also signed up, but I'll give you another 10 seconds. All right, let's do it. DSGE. Dramatic. What relationship gives rise to the IS equation in the DSGE model? Is it the goods market clearing condition, the Euler equation, labor market clearing condition, or profit maximization? Yes, it's the Euler equation. So if you recall, can I write this here? Say one more word about it. Oops. You know, an Euler equation typically looks something like expected. I should be careful with that expectation, but yeah, let's get rid of the expectation just for fun. Euler equation is going to be u prime ct plus 1 is equal to, u prime ct is equal to, let's say, beta times r times u prime ct plus 1, t plus 1. This would be sort of a typical sort of Euler equation. My u here does not look like a u. It's like a w. Let's try that again. U. Okay, so what this says is that, yeah, whatever. So this is now relating sort of consumption and the interest rate. Okay, and then if you watch the video, then we had assumed that there's no savings. So then we can just think about this as output, say something like this. All right, and now this thing is looking very close to our the equation from the slides. You know, take logs here, and you'll see that we have the interest rate. We're relating to current consumption or current output, and then also a future output. Okay, so it's very closely related to this Euler equation, the IS equation in the DSGE model. So that's that. Okey doke. If shocks have no persistence, what is the expected value of output next period, detrended? So if there's no persistence in the shocks, what do we expect output to be tomorrow? So this period, you can vary its value in 0, 0, dips negative relative to maybe you should have said log and detrended. Okay, so yeah, actually, you know, I wrote this and I said same as this period, but that's actually not quite right? Because this period, there's shocks. So if we just look quickly at the slides again. So let's look at the version where there's no persistence. Here. Okay, maybe this is the right place to look right here. So there's no persistence now in the shocks, which means that the expectations of tomorrow, this is kind of it, right, are all going to be 0 because this is expectations relative to trend. So it's like, you know, what we think the output's going to be minus the trend output. So there can be growth. It's just our expectations relative to that trend. Here you can see they're all 0. So will output today be the same as yesterday? Well, probably not, right? Because these shocks are like random draws. So it means that, you know, output today, it's very unlikely I'm going to get exactly the same shock as I got yesterday. So output today is probably not going to be the same as it was yesterday. And output tomorrow is probably not going to be the same as today. But because these shocks don't have any persistence, our best guess about output tomorrow is that it's just going to be trend output. Does that make sense? So, you know, we can't learn anything about what output tomorrow will be from what output was today if there's no persistence in these shocks. It's just going to be, you know, a random draw tomorrow, basically. So stop me if you have any questions, by the way. If shocks have no persistence, what is the interest rate this period? Mean 0 shock depends on the inflation rate, 0 or dips negative relative to trend, overshoots. Yeah, it's a mean zero shock. So I can just show you on this slide again. I think it's easiest to look at it that way. Oops, what happened? There we go. For some reason, when I drag it, disappears. Okay. So down here, you can see that the interest rate here is just today. The interest rate today is going to be equal to this shock, right? UTMP, monetary policy. So this thing here is just a mean zero random shock. So we
You
don't.
aren't sharing your screen. It's just your face.
Oh, something must have got screwed up there. Now you guys can see my screen. But now I didn't.
Yeah.
Now I didn't share the music, so I'm going to stop again and share one more time. Be sure to click share computer sound. Okay, now you should see it and you can hear it. But anyway, yeah, so there's no, this interest rate is not, it's not zero, but it's just going to be a mean zero random draw. Okay. The expectation is zero. So that part's right, but it's just that the shock itself will not be zero almost surely. Back here. DB's on a streak. Stock market has always risen when Fed announces low interest rate. Does Lucas' critique apply? So if I were to take that relationship as, you know, a description of the economy, does the Lucas critique apply to it? That the stock market always rises when the Fed announces low interest rates. I look back at the history of the economy and I see that this always happens. Yeah. If I take that as sort of an economic law, does the Lucas critique apply to it? Wow, almost everybody said no, but the actual answer was yes. So, I mean, it could be, this question was a bit, I had trouble phrasing it, so I might have not phrased it clearly. But the idea is that, you know, the statistical relationship between the stock market level and the Fed's policy rate, you know, that's the outcome of a lot of underlying relationships. You know, maybe most importantly, people's expectations, you know, people's preferences, technologies that firms have for producing things, you know, the Fed's policies for changing the interest rates. So, you know, all these things, you know, if I change one of the policies, it could very well change this statistical relationship. You know, maybe most directly, suppose that that the Fed changes the way that it sets interest rates. You know, it changes its policy rule. Well, then that might very well change the relationship between the Fed's announcements and the stock market. You know, this statistical relationship is not policy invariant. It depends on the policies that the government is doing, in particular the Fed's policies for setting interest rate. So since our policies can change, you know, government policy can change this relationship, this isn't sort of a fundamental relationship. It's not policy invariant. So the Lucas critique says when you're modeling, you should model things that aren't affected by policies. Okay. So I'll talk about that more, but I know the next question is also about the Lucas critique. So let me do that one first. People always prefer green apples over red if they're the same price. Does the Lucas critique apply? You know, if I take that as a fundamental, you know, I've seen that that's always true. I take it as a fundamental aspect of the economy. Am I okay relative to the Lucas critique? Yeah, so does the Lucas critique apply? The answer is no. And the reason why is because this is about people's preferences, at least often in economics models. Now this, you know, we could argue about this assumption, but we assume that things that people like, you know, the things that people prefer, you know, if they prefer, say, green apples over red apples, that's not something that you can change by decree. Like, you know, if the Federal Reserve changes its policies or people, you know, the government changes the structure of taxation, you know, if it raises the taxes on this or that, then, you know, does that affect people's preferences? The answer is no, right? Because it's more, that's something fundamental about what people like or what they don't like. Okay, or at least we assume it is. I mean, I see how you could argue against that, but yeah. So the idea would be, again, if they're the same price, do people prefer green apples to red? If the answer is yes, then whatever the government does, it's not going to change this particular statement. Okay, it will change the relationship. If the Fed changes its policy, it changes the relationship between the stock market and Federal Reserve interest rate announcements. So we would say that preferences here are policy invariants. So preferences and technology is often the two things that, at least in macroeconomics, we consider policy invariant, right? So it means that when you're writing down a model, if you want to sort of defend yourself against this Lucas critique, you don't want to start with these relationships. You don't want to start by positing these three relationships. That just says, oh, I've looked at the data, the historical data, and it seems that whenever the interest rate goes up, then the output goes down. You don't want to do that. Maybe the difference between these three relationships and these three equations and the traditional Keynesian equations is really kind of about their derivation. So each of these things comes out of a more fundamental economics model that is based on preferences in production technology, rather than just, this is what I say it is type of thing. This one comes out, I went through it in the lecture online, but this one comes out of, as we just talked about, the Euler equation. So individual maximization behavior. This one comes out of a sticky price model. So the idea again is that when if I'm a firm and I'm not always sure I'm going to be able to change my prices, if output is high, then that's when I want to raise my price. Okay, so the higher is output, the more I want to raise my price. That's why output is related to inflation today. And then also, if I expect if I expect inflation to be high tomorrow, I know that I might not be able to change my price tomorrow. So I might want to raise my price more than I otherwise would have today. Okay, so it comes out of that model. And then this one doesn't. This one is just a policy rule. So this one doesn't really come out of a deep model, but these two do. So maybe that's the real difference between our DSGE and the old-fashioned Keynesian models. That's going to be right. Congratulations. All right, so let's stop that, and we will go to the slides. So let's do. Oh, I can find the slides here. They are. So now just kind of opening up for general questions about this new Keynesian DSGE model.
Yeah, can I begin?
Sure.
And can we begin at the beginning, right? When you started your intro on the videos, you talked about until now and the real business cycle and sticky prices and Lucas critique, right? And you pointed out some flaws with the previous models that we've covered, right?
Okay.
And then you don't say it, but you kind of imply it that this DSGE model is like what the central banks use, and it's the best alternative. It has the micro foundations and everything. But then you also say that we just put in parameters and plug and chuck, right?
Yes. So you're saying that these are micro-founded, and yet ultimately,
anyway, this was just the intro.
Yeah. So ultimately, this looks like a macro 101 model. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. That's, you kind of spoiled my question, but yeah, that was kind of it. In the end, it ends there.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that so two things. First, it's not exactly a macro 101 model, and the difference is these expectations. And in practice, these expectations can be very important, and there can be a lot of discussion about how people form expectations. And there's a million research papers about the right way to think about these things. So there's that, and you'll notice that when we were actually looking at this model in class, we kind of shut these things down, right? We just said, okay, these are equal to 0. But if you're going to kind of do a better job, then these things are not 0. And if you have persistent shocks, and then things become a little bit more complicated. So, if you look at the way that these slides went, I said, okay, it's 0. The shocks are not persistent. And then here's what happens. And then if we had persistent shocks, then you'd get numbers like this, but I didn't actually solve that model. So, that is actually somewhat of a complex model to solve. And, there's much more behind it than just what's on the slides here, thinking about these expectations. So that's true. On the other hand, there's a reason why this is called New Keynesian, right? It's called New Keynesian because it does end up looking a bit like old Keynesian. It's kind of a micro-founded version of old Keynesian models. Now, what's the advantage from the New Keynesian perspective? Because these are micro-founded, we get some insight into what these parameters should be. Okay, so I'd have to actually I'd have to kind of look back at the models and see exactly what these correspond to. But suppose that this is something related to the elasticity of substitution between the time preference or something like that. That's something that maybe I can measure in the data, right? And then down here, if I look at the way that firms behave when they're setting prices, then maybe I can learn something about the parameter kappa. So the micro foundation gives us some input there as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that your point is correct, that at the end of the day, these do look a lot like old-fashioned Keynesian models. But
Yeah, but do you still enjoy these models? Do you think I could go to the central bank and be like, yeah, I know these new Keynesian models, right? I learned them in my
yeah.
class. And they would believe me and say that, yeah, you have a good foundation. Or
Oh, for knowing the kind of things that they work on? I mean, if you knew new Keynesian models, I think they would be happy about that. So, I'm giving you just a sketch here of a new Keynesian model. Maybe if you wanted to say, write your master's thesis about, some relatively, okay, so if you want to know what people are really doing these days, like what's the cutting edge, I don't know if it's cutting edge, but what people are doing in terms of research these days. So all of the models we've looked at are these representative agent models, but now people are getting more worried about distributions, right? So what people have been doing recently is putting heterogeneity into these macro models. So like what they've been calling Hank models are what people are really kind of excited about these days. So that would be heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models, Hank. So if you want, so suppose you were gunning to get a job in a central bank, and you wanted to sort of prove that you know your stuff, maybe doing something in your master's thesis related to these sort of cutting edge heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models, which are going to be they're going to be related to the models we looked at in class. That might be a good idea.
okay, thanks for this information.
Sure.
But I was more going towards that. I mean, in the end, these are all just theories, and we're kind of just learning the history of these theories and how they went like through the changes in time and just began after Keynes. Yeah, there was something going on before, but
Absolutely.
and I don't know. I just feel like these are, of course, my opinions and feelings towards these classes, that I'm not learning the real stuff about the real stuff. I'm just still learning the history of the stuff.
I see.
I don't know.
So, I mean, an alternative class could be we start with this model and then we talk about different flavors. We could add, we could put in sort of persistence and, yeah, what do they call that? Habit formation. We could talk about, you know, exactly like I was just saying, heterogeneous agents uh, versus representative agents. We could do that, right? So then that would be kind of like a toolbox where that would be very similar to what maybe somebody that's at a central bank might be trying to decide which model to use, and that might be useful. Um,
Yeah, but maybe not useful in a business school. in the end.
Yeah, maybe not. Or, another thing to say is, there is some insight, right, in each of these models, I think. So, think about like, okay, we're looking at the Lucas imperfect information model. Obviously, that's a model that was written in the 1970s, but, it explains the kind of friction you need in order to get money to have an effect without putting money into the utility function.
Yeah, but sometimes the insight is just this doesn't work in the end. Like it is it okay, the Lucas critique is obviously like a one that works and is good, but I don't know, but like the real business cycle is just yeah, okay.
Yeah, the real business cycle was very influential at the time because at the time people didn't know how to make a business cycle look anything like a real world business cycle without having sort of Keynesian stuff in there. So like, the multiplier effects and things like that.
Yeah, so
So
like the micro foundation was missing.
exactly. So they came out and said, no, you don't need any of that. You don't need money to cause business cycles. You get fairly realistic looking business cycles just with shocks. And you don't need to have and you don't need people to have funny expectations. Like you don't need it to be the case that the economist understands the economy better than the people that are in the economy, which would be a critique from like say earlier Keynesian models. But yeah, it's fair enough. I guess you could teach it in different ways. I think that this class is sort of a standard master's macro class. So, I mean, obviously we're teaching out of a fairly widely used textbook. So, I think that this would be a class that you can build on in many places.
Yeah, even taught by an American that makes it real real
Absolutely.
standard.
Absolutely. Although I did say that the government isn't always bad. So maybe, so even though the textbook makes it seem like that.
It's because you have been too long in Denmark. It's like
Exactly.
bad influence.
Exactly. It's rubbing off.
Maybe
Yeah, I guess
maybe
I
you
didn't have
should
anything more to say about this. Sorry, let's let you speak now.
yeah, maybe you should try to get a like progressive elective for the third semester and then do something like you were saying before. Because I don't think there's that many macro courses. No, there's more like monetary policy and that's kind of it.
That's right. So I mean, there is actually, so your options, and I think I've talked to a couple of you guys about this. But one option if you want to go more deep into this is there is a PhD course that is taught in the fall in my department. I'm actually teaching part of it, but not the macro part. There's a real macroeconomist who's teaching the macro part. And I think that one's a lot about methodology. So he teaches a lot about how to solve complicated models. So again, we're kind of waving our hands a bit here and saying, well, if there's no persistence in shocks, then look, everything is really simple. But then if there is persistence, then these models are not simple to solve. So he's going to talk about techniques for solving them. And that would, of course, be interesting for those of you that are interested in pursuing macroeconomics farther as like a career. So that's an option. I'm teaching a part of the course about economic geography and trade, which is what most of my research is actually about. So.
Can I ask one question about the new Keynesian IS curve? How can it be that we don't have any savings technology, but still say that this model is kind of state of the art? Because at least as far as I can see, we can save in the real world.
People do say, Ethan.
Yes.
That's true.
But here's kind of an outcome that they do not want to save, right? That was the trick that they used.
That's the trick. That's how you get from the Euler equation to this equation here, right? Because you can see my screen. You can replace this c in the Euler equation with a y, right? So that's the trick. Yeah, of course, that's true. How would it affect things? So I mean, one thing, so one way to, so again, you're right. Okay. But now suppose that I'm trying to defend this model. This model is already going to be very pared down because we have a representative agent. And again, the state of the art stuff, the real state of the art stuff is the heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models. That's what people are working on these days. But with a representative agent, then if one person wants to save, then everybody wants to save. So then there's nobody to lend anything. Does that make sense? So I mean, it's true that in the real world, obviously people save and that matters. Of course, they save across their life cycle. Now the difference here is that we only have one type of person. So since there's only one type of person, if anybody, like I don't have to repeat myself again, but it's sort of a natural outcome of the assumption that we began with, that everybody's the same, that there's only one type of agent. Note here a difference with some of the models we looked at earlier. So when we were looking at, say, the Lucas information model, there the firms get individual shocks, right? So different firms get different shocks. So that's not a model where everybody's the same. This one they are, though. So it would be hard to put realistic savings into this model for that reason.
Can you go over again the inertia that comes from the New Keynesian Phillips curve?
Yeah, I can flip to the slide. Sure, I can flip to the slide, or I can just say it again. But the idea would flip to the slide. So yeah, so I mean, I think I said, look, you can see this inertia here. The expected inflation tomorrow relative to today is related to the level of inflation today. But I mean, really, it comes from this relationship we already talked about, which is that if I'm a firm and I know that I won't be able to change my price every period, if I think that inflation is going to be high tomorrow, then I'm going to raise my price more today. So that leads to this relationship between inflation tomorrow and inflation today, this positive correlation. And here we're putting a name on that positive correlation, and we're calling it inertia.
So you'd say that the inertia is just the expectation for today.
Yeah.
Because I'm making the prices today, because I don't know what they are tomorrow, and I can't, or I don't know what the price level is, and I can't change them tomorrow, maybe.
Exactly. So, I mean, so how is it going to work? If I think the inflation, the price level tomorrow is going to be high, then that's going to lead me to have high inflation today. So then you get this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If I expect that inflation is going to be low tomorrow, that's going to make me lower prices today. So that's going to induce this relative to what I would have already done. So that's going to sort of induce this correlation between periods. But yeah, that's right.
All right, I'll just keep going then. And then I wanted to talk about the third equation and the one tool for two objectives problem that kind of arises from this equation.
Okay.
That I believe, I mean, we could solve it just by adding one more equation, I guess, and one more tool.
Well, that's a key, right? Adding one more equation is fine, but you need to add another tool. So what are you thinking of for the central bank to do? It's very popular these days. Another sort of recent sort of macroeconomics phenomenon is that people talk about macro-prudential policy. I don't know if you've heard of this, but these days this interest rate has a zero lower bound, right? You can't actually set the interest rate very, very much below zero. And the reason why is because then people just they just want to hold on to cash. So it doesn't actually, you can't actually induce economic activity once the interest rate is very, very low. Whatever. So the idea would be they want to have other tools, but so there's a lot of talk about what sort of tools they could have. They could have discretion about, how much, what sort of capital requirements banks would have for lending. Some people have even proposed, kind of more extreme people have said, maybe the government itself should be a lender. So the government should be able to lend to businesses directly. in which case the government sort of becomes a bank. So yeah, so I'm with you. I'm with you that it's sort of an interesting question about what extra tools you might use to hit several things. And here we're saying that what the central bank wants is it wants to hit both, say, output and interest rate. They want to control both of those things, or inflation rate. They want to control both of those things. But maybe they want to control other things too, right? So maybe they want to also, output is not just unemployment. So maybe they want to control output and unemployment and the inflation rate, and they want to also control something about, inequality or profits of firms. You could imagine a big list of things that you think would be important for the economy. Competition. So you could imagine central banks really directing a lot more of the economy than they direct today. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, but people are talking about it.
But what if we imagine the central bank just controlling less and just taking more of a supportive role and just saying, yeah, things are going like this right now. You just do what you think is best.
I mean, if you're
smaller government and all that.
Yeah, if you agree with the real business cycle and you think that the shocks just kind of are shocks to technology that are somewhat unavoidable, and it's not about expectations and like self-fulfilling prophecies and Keynesian beauty contests and things like that, maybe the best policy of the government is just to do nothing. So that's certainly a point of view that some economists have. Probably not most macroeconomists, because macroeconomists like the idea
then they would be out of a job.
Yeah, exactly. They like the idea that they can make the economy run better than it does. In the interest of a macroeconomist, you could look at history and say that between 1980 and the Great Recession, there was actually very little fluctuation in inflation and economic output relative to trend. Any other questions about DSG? Yeah, there's definitely other things that aren't here, right? So I mean, there's also, now this isn't monetary policy, but certainly there's a lot of discussion these days about fiscal policy, right? So we haven't really talked about fiscal policy at all. This is purely about monetary policy. So fiscal policy is something else that's important. I'm not even sure if, I can't remember if there's a section in the textbook that talks about fiscal policy actually. But these days, there's all this modern monetary macro, and also just generally Keynesian economists who think that the government should be spending a lot more money. Right now, the interest rates are low. It's cheap to borrow. So that's not here, of course.
No, it would also be very strange for the university to teach these theories.
That's all part of macro, though. So if we're gonna have a course called macroeconomics, it wouldn't be so out of place. So I know there's a couple of other people that teach macro besides me here at CBS, and we compare notes occasionally. So I think that some people cover sort of investment theory a little bit more, like what's how you should think about investing, and what firms are worth, Tobin's Q. Maybe you had that in finance, in asset pricing. I think that some people that do labor in their research do a little bit about labor search models. There's a chapter in the textbook about that, but this is the basics, right? So everybody's going to talk about growth and the business cycle. I think of them as kind of the fundamental topics in macroeconomics. Okay. If there are no more questions, then let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and I'll solve the rest of problem set 3. Okay, so I figured that this time, rather than oh, I have to share my screen. I guess you guys lost the countdown timer there. This time, rather than write out my notes and then like on a piece of paper, which is what I've been doing, and then solve them in front of you and then make all sorts of algebraic errors, I figured, why don't I just write out my notes on the computer and then I can just talk through my answers. Isn't that easier? So that's what I did. So I've actually now solved 611 here, and I've got 616 here. I'll try to go to both of them today. So 611, this one is about menu costs, and it talks about multiple equilibria. So one of the things in the menu cost model, if you recall, is that we said, is it an equilibrium if no one changes their prices, right? If that's kind of like, are the prices sticky, right? That was this idea. And we looked for this one equilibrium, but we didn't talk about whether there could be other equilibriums. I think maybe I mentioned that there could be other equilibria, right? So in this question, we're going to think about a simple model, a little simplified model, and we're going to think about whether there could be more than one equilibrium in this model. Okay, so it's going to be a menu cost, but with potentially multiple equilibria. So setup, consider an economy. It's got imperfectly competitive firms, just like in the model we looked at. The profits a firm loses relative to what it obtains with PI is equal to P star are given by this little thing here. So in other words, let me just write it out. I'll show you how I wrote it out here. The gain, if pi is like profits, I think this is the right way to write it, by the way. If pi is profits, then the profits that the firm gets when it changes its price relative to the profits it gets if it doesn't change its price is going to be given by this thing here. Okay, that's how I understand this. Profits the firm loses relative to what it obtains, exactly. So if it sets its price equal to P star, then it gets this profit. If it sets its price equal to PI, then it gets this profit. So here's like the benefit, if you like, to changing your price. This is what the firm is facing, okay? Now, as usual, P star is equal to P plus phi y, where phi is some positive parameter, but it could be greater or less than 1. And then y is equal to m minus p, right? So this is that Keynesian demand drive supply type of aggregate demand function. Okay. So each firm is going to face a fixed cost z of changing its nominal price. Initially, m is equal to 0, and that means y is equal to 0, p is equal to 0, and then suppose that m changes to m prime. Then the first question, suppose that a fraction f of firms change their prices, since the firms that change their prices charge P star, and the firms that do not charge 0, this implies that P is equal to F times P star. Okay. Use this fact to find P, Y, and P star. Okay. So I'm just writing out what they gave us in the problem. So P is equal to FP star. Okay. And from the setup up here, we see that P star is equal to P plus phi y. So we've got P star equals P plus phi y. Now let's plug in our definition of P, which is FP star. And we'll plug in our definition of Y, which is M minus P. But of course, P is equal to FP star. So, so putting those things together, we get that P plus phi y is equal to FP star plus phi times M prime now. It's not M, it's M prime, minus P, which is FP star. Okay. So why is this nice for us? Well, you'll notice that we're basically left with P star and we're left with M. prime. So let's solve for P star. That was one of the things they asked for in the question. Looking back here, it says use this fact to find Py and P star as functions of M prime and F. Okay, so we're going to solve for P star here, and we get this relationship. Okay, so we're relating P star to M prime and F. So we're done with P star. We've got P star. Once we've got P star, it's easy for us to get P. It's just P star times F. Okay, so there it is. P is equal to F times P star. And then finally we have Y, but Y is just M minus P. Okay, so it's M prime minus this function here of M prime. So it's going to be 1, right? M prime minus this expression times M prime. So take M prime up front, do a little algebra, and you end up with this relationship here. Okay, we can think about this relationship a little bit. So F is some number between 0 and 1. Okay, so the numerator is positive. The denominator, it's 1 minus F, and then here we've got this 1 minus phi. And phi is a number that is greater than 0, but it could be either greater than or less than 1. And you can see this is going to be important, right? So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Okay. Second question. B, plot a firm's incentive to adjust its price, K0 minus P star squared is equal to K P star squared as a function of F. Okay. Be sure to distinguish cases where phi is less than 1 and where phi is greater than 1. Okay. Well, they want it as a function of F. Okay, so let's put F on the x-axis. And F, of course, it's the fraction of firms. So that's going to go from 0 to 1. Fraction of firms that change their price. And here, this is like the benefit the firm gets if it changes its price. Okay, so we're supposed to plot this thing. All right. First, let's consider the case where phi is less than 1. Okay, so first let's start off by just setting F to 0. Okay, so what would that be? Did I write it out here somewhere? Well, this is going to be, okay, so I've dropped the K, but this is P star to the P star squared, excuse me. So if F is 0, you can see that this denominator is just going to be 1. So we're going to get phi times M prime. So up here you get K times phi times M prime. Phi is less than 1, so it means we're somewhere below K M prime squared. Okay, so we know that when we're at 0, we're down here somewhere. Okay, if phi was greater than 1, excuse me, then we're going to be up here because K times phi times M prime squared is going to be greater than K M prime squared. Okay, so that's that. And then we have to think what happens when F is 1. Well, when F is 1, you can see this whole thing is going to simplify to phi divided by phi. So it's just going to be M prime squared. So we've got K M prime squared. We know that in both cases, whether phi is greater than or less than 1, when F is equal to 1, we're going to be here on this K M prime squared position on the graph. Okay, so then the only question to answer really is this thing's slope increasing? Is it concave or convex? And the same for this one. So if you do a derivative, I guess this gives me the slope. And then you can see the slope is going to depend on this 1 minus phi term. If this thing is greater than 1, the slope is going to be negative. If it's less than 1, it's going to be positive. And then down here, this thing is always positive, I believe. I should be careful. Suppose phi is greater than 1, it's positive. Suppose phi is less than 1, it's positive too. Yeah. So this denominator is always positive. Okay. So we're increasing if this thing is if phi is less than 1, and we're decreasing if phi is greater than 1. And then what else do I have to say here? I guess I probably should have taken a second derivative here to get whether it's concave or convex. But But in any case, if you do it, you're going to find that up here it is convex, and this one looks like it's also convex, actually. So both give you a positive sign. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think it does. Okay, so that's B. This is the plot, and it says that your incentive to change your price if f gets larger is increasing if phi is less than 1, and it's decreasing if phi is greater than 1. I had to think about some intuition there, but it's not forthcoming. Okay, so part C, a firm adjusts its price if the benefit exceeds Z, and it does not adjust if the benefit is less than Z, and it's indifferent if the benefit is exactly C. Given this, can there be a situation where both adjustment by all firms and adjustment by no firms are equilibria? Can there be a situation where neither adjustment by all firms nor adjustment by no firms is in equilibrium? So we can just look at our graph kind of. So let's suppose that Z is in between, well, when phi is less than 1, let me just show you in the graph. Let's suppose that Z is here. Okay, so it's somewhere in this area between these two poles, between km prime squared and k phi m prime squared. So suppose that Z is in here somewhere. That's the cost. And then the idea would be, you know, for levels of f down here, you wouldn't want to change. For levels of f up here, you would want to change because the cost is here, where this blue line is. Okay. So now we can think about different situations. So suppose that we're in the situation where no one changes their price. Okay, then down here, if no one is changing their price, then you can see that the cost of changing is up here, but the benefit is down there. So that means that no firm, if everybody else doesn't change their price, then I also don't want to change my price. So it says that not changing your price is an equilibrium. Suppose that every firm is changing its price, and the cost is here. Well, then you can see that if every firm is changing its price, then I also want to change my price. So that's also an equilibrium. So both nobody changing their price and everybody changing their price is equilibrium. Now we only have one other case to think about, which is what if the payoff to changing it, what if the f was right here, whatever value of f that is? Well, then I'm indifferent between changing my price and not changing my price. And you know, only a fraction of firms change their price. So that again is an equilibrium. You know, we can just set that fraction to whatever we want because firms don't really care. They get the same benefit if they do and if they don't change their price after netting out the cost. So I've just written that out here. If f is equal to 0, best response is not to change. If f is equal to 1, best response is to change. If f is such that this equation is true, the best response is indifferent. So that means that all three of these things are equilibria. Okay. Now let's do the same thing up here on the top side. So if phi is greater than 1, okay, let's just think of it. Let's think again. So now if no firms change their price and the cost is here, then I do want to change my price. You can see that then my benefit is higher than the cost of changing my price. So no firms changing price is not an equilibrium because the best response for any one firm then is to change the price. Okay. Now let's look at the other side. Suppose all firms are changing their price. What's the best response? Well, the cost is up here. My benefit from changing my price is below the cost. So I don't want to change my price. Okay, so that's also not an equilibrium. If all firms are changing the price, best response is to not change price. So that means that can't possibly be equilibrium because firms have an incentive to deviate. Okay, so neither of those are equilibria. Now, what if we're at that point where the cost is exactly equal to the benefit? Well, then firms are indifferent between changing and not. So actually here, that is an equilibrium. I don't care whether I change or not. So, you know, you can just set the number of firms that change their price to be in equilibrium. Okay. So there, again, if f is equal to 0, best response is to change. That's not an equilibrium. If f is equal to 1, best response is don't change. That's also not an equilibrium. And if f is such that this equation holds, then the best response includes both, and only the last one there is an equilibrium. Okay, so both situations that they asked for in the problem are actually possible. Okay, so they said, can there be a situation where both adjustment by all firms and adjustment by no firms are equilibria? The answer is yes. All right, that was when phi is less than 1. Can there be a situation where neither adjustment by all firms nor adjustment by no firms is an equilibrium? Yeah, that's the situation where phi is greater than 1. Okay. So that's it for 611. I see. Any questions? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, then the second question that was assigned is this one, which is actually more kind of a chatty question, actually. So suppose that the money supply is, okay, observational equivalence. Suppose that the money supply is determined by MT C times ZT minus 1 plus E, where C and Z are vectors and ET is an IID disturbance uncorrelated with ZT minus 1 time, ZT minus 1. And then ET is white noise. You can't predict it. It's unobservable. So the expected component of MT then is just the part that we can predict. And the unexpected component is this part that we can't predict. So in setting the money supply, suppose that the Federal Reserve responds only to variables that matter for real activity. That is, the variables in Z directly affect Y. Okay. So now consider two models. So one is that only unexpected money matters. Okay, so that's kind of like the monies we were talking about, or the models we've been talking about. It's only the surprises that the market gets from the Fed that actually affect output. Or suppose that all money matters. Maybe the whole level of the amount of money that's in the economy matters. Okay, so suppose we had these two models. This one maybe is more market, sort of old-fashioned Friedman-style monetary policy, says that the amount of money in the economy is what matters. And this is maybe the more newfangled monetary policy that says that really it's surprises to the market that matter, because people expect most of what's in the money supply. Okay, so we got two models. We want to know which one is real, which one is the one that actually describes the real world. Okay, so first question, is it possible to distinguish between these two theories? That is, given a candidate set of parameter values, say model I, are there parameter values under model II that have the same predictions? Explain. All right, so let's look in here. This is the way that the Fed is setting monetary policy. Okay. This thing is observable. This thing is not. It's unpredictable. Okay, so the question is it model I that's correct, that only the surprises that the Fed delivers affect output? Or is it model 2 that's correct that says, no, it's the whole money supply that matters for output? Okay, so to make things clear, let's call A, when it's in expression I, we're going to put a subscript 1 on it. And when it's in model 2 or model II, we're going to put a 2 under the A, just to keep clear what we mean by the different A's. Okay, so if we look at these two models and we just do one thing, let's replace this MT with its definition up here with the Fed's policy, then model 1 is going to look the same, but model 2 is now going to have this B2C ZT minus 1 plus B2 ET in it. Okay, so we've just replaced MT with its definition from the top. Okay, and now you can just see very clearly that we've got an E up here in model I, we've got an E down here in model II, we've got a ZT minus 1 up here, up here in model I, and we've got a ZT minus 1 term here in model II, we've got a VT and a VT. All we have to do is just set the coefficients that multiply ZT minus 1 equal in these two models, and the coefficients that multiply ET to be equal in these two models. So we got A1 is equal to A2 plus B2C, and B2 is equal to B1. Then the models are going to be absolutely equivalent. They're going to be observationally equivalent. You can never tell them apart because you give me the parameters from one model and I can just translate them into parameters from the other model that will give you exactly the same results. Okay, so no data, I think I wrote it here. You can't separate them empirically. No data will ever allow you to separate these two models. So if this were the real world, we would never be able to know whether it's only surprises that matter or whether it's the money supply as a whole that matters. Cleaning my apartment stairwell. Okay. Okay. Let's look at the second problem. Suppose that the Federal Reserve also responds to some variables that do not directly affect output. That is, suppose that MT is equal to, again, ZT minus 1 times C, but now also gamma times WT minus 1, where these WT minus 1, it's the height of people's skirts, or it's, whether the Fed chairman, that's a bad one, because that wouldn't be predictable then, but it's, let's see here. What would be something predictable? Maybe the temperature over the last 2 months, whatever. Maybe that would affect output. Yeah, it's hard to think of a perfect example here, but yeah, the height of people's skirts is a traditional one. So let's say that one, the height of skirts this year in terms of fashion. Okay, so now that we know the Fed is doing that, now can we separate these two models? Okay, so let's do the same calculation that we did before. It's just now that instead of replacing MT with CZT minus 1 plus ET, it's going to be CZT minus 1 plus gamma times WT minus 1 plus ET, okay? And now we're in a very different world. Why is that? Because model 1, it has a ZT minus 1, but it does not have a WT, okay? So, so that means that now we actually can differentiate these two models. Why is that? Because WT minus 1, under model 1, it has no effect on output. Under model 2, model II, it does have an effect on output, okay, as long as gamma is not equal to 0. So all I have to do is just see, is there this correlation between WT minus 1 and YT? So I look at some data, I see if there's a correlation there. If there is, I can test it, and I can see if I can reject the idea that the correlation between WT minus 1 and YT is 0. If I can reject that, that says that model 2 is likely correct. Okay, so now they are actually distinguishable. So that's kind of it. I think the point is kind of to say that sometimes with these sort of models in macroeconomics, you can have different theories that lead to the same predictions since we can't observe the underlying parameters of the models. So sometimes they lead to the same prediction, sometimes you can differentiate between them. Okay. Yeah, so that's it. Any questions about either 6.16 or 6.11? Okay, so if not, then let me just say 2 words about what we're going to do next. So the next section in the course is going to be about international macro, and we really aren't going to do too much. We're going to have a lecture about some puzzles in international macro. For instance, why is it that people invest in their own country so much? There's a home bias in investments. That seems crazy. Take it to a firm level. You wouldn't want to buy all the stock in the firm where you work and have all of your savings there, because then if the firm goes under, you both lose your savings and you also lose your labor income, right? So there's like a correlated shock there. So for the same reason, you might think that it would be crazy to invest more in the country you live rather than in other countries. But it turns out that people massively invest in the country they live in and not as much in other countries. So it seems sort of crazy. So we're going to think about problems like that in international macro. And then we're going to read a paper that offers some solutions. Basically, it's going to say that it's all about trade costs. So we'll see. But yeah, so that's the lecture for next week. So please do watch that video. And
Is that something we should have like behind our ears when we watch the videos about the bias and the cost?
I'm gonna talk about it, right?
Ah.
So it'll be in there. If you want, you can read the paper. It might be interesting by Rogoff.
Your next assignment is gonna be mock exam.
It'll be a mock exam, and it'll be a mock exam, and I might add a couple question on top about the models we've covered that since we had our last problem set.
And this would be quite representative for the final exam.
Yeah, and I actually just got an email from somebody that said, can you post some other exams? I've been teaching this course long enough, and then every time I teach it, I have to post 2 exams because there's the regular exam and then the retake. So I actually do have a number of exams, so I can post some representative exams.
That's great to hear. And last year you had a home exam, or was it in?
Last year I had a home exam, but it was almost the same as a regular exam. I didn't really change anything. My exams don't typically have multiple choice. I know that was something that people said that you shouldn't do, but since I didn't have multiple choice, there wasn't that much I had to change. You know, it's a 3-hour exam, and part of the constraint is just that, or is it a 4-hour exam? It's just that, you know, there's a limited amount of time. So it's, you know,
It's 4 hour.
Yeah, but you know, just like the fact that you can look through your book doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to change really too much the content, but you'll see. So what I'm going to do is the exam from last year, that will be the homework assignment for this year.
Cool.
That's what I typically do. And then, you know, of course, we'll solve that in class. And then I'll post some other exams too. Okay, cool. So thanks a lot, guys. See you next week.
Yeah, thanks for class. Bye.